Hello, readers by eyes and by ears. This is Mari Chen, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today, I am super excited because we are finishing the final 3 chapters of Stars of Chaos, Volume 2, also known as Sha Po Lang by Priest. That's going to be chapter 60, 61, and 62, and I am ready to see what happens and then move on to book 3. Yay! So, we're just going to go ahead and get straight to it, okay? All right, I hope you all enjoy. Chapter 60, Cannon Fire. Chang Geng took hold of the military report. What of the Jiangnan Navy remains? Gu Yuan asked. Hard to say. Chang Geng skimmed the missive. Our dragon warships have never gone out to sea, much less engaged in true naval battles. When Zhao Youfang fell, the troops under his command panicked and scattered in all directions. Yifu, do you remember back when Prince Wei attempted his armed rebellion? Gu Yuan pinched the bridge of his nose, understanding at once what he was getting at. Back then, Prince Wei had bribed the Jiangnan Navy and Navy commander along with half his forces and amassed an army in the islets near Dongying. From this foothold, he greedily eyed the capital. But to his surprise, before he could complete preparations, his plans were scuttled by the joint efforts of Gu Yuan and the Linyuan Pavilion. Or rather, on paper, it was the joint effort between Gu Yuan and the Linyuan Pavilion, but in reality, Gu Yuan had been accompanied only by a handful of Black Hawks and a couple of half-grown children at the time. Likewise, the Linyuan Pavilion had merely dispatched 30-odd members of the Jianghu, including that useless monk Liao Zhan who, after climbing into a suit of heavy armor, didn't even know how to climb back out again. Gu Yuan was highly respected in the military, so the case might be made that his sudden appearance, which cowed the rebel forces into submission, had been a major factor in that mission's success. Yet this case only further proved that Great Liang's navy was its greatest handicap. It couldn't even pull off a proper rebellion with ease. If such an incident had occurred during the late Yuanhe Emperor's reign, Gu Yuan might have seized the opportunity to do as he did with the Northern Border Defense Corps and involve himself in the reorganization of the naval troops. Unfortunately, Li Feng was nothing like the soft, tender-hearted late emperor who wavered irresolutely when it came to killing anyone. Such unilateral action was no longer possible under the long-gone emperor's reign. What about Yao Chongzi? Is he dead too? Gu Yuan asked. There is no mention of him, Chang Geng responded. There were too many killed in action for a full accounting. Gu Yuan sighed. So, what exactly is this sea monster? Chang Geng scanned the report. Apparently, it looks like a giant octopus and has the ability to hide underwater. When it surfaces, it towers over the ocean like a mountain and possesses overwhelming power. Compared to the giant kite, the latter looks like a pigeon sitting on the shoulder of a brawny man. It's equipped with countless iron tentacles covered in thousands upon thousands of small dragon warships, and when the tip opens, they release huge flocks of armored hawks. At some point, Chang Geng paused and tapped lightly on the report with a slender finger. If this is true, they're burning through at least 200 or 300 kilograms of violet gold a day. Gu Yuan shot him a look, but Chang Geng shook his head slightly. Having made his point, he went no further, his voice petering out as he elided the rest. The fact that the Westerners had invested such a huge quantity of violet gold meant they likely wanted to end this as swiftly as possible. They've dealt with Jiangnan, so there's no need for them to worry about an enemy attacking from the rear by sea as they advance. The fleet at Daku Harbor is no match for them, so their next move will be to make landfall and press on toward the capital. Gu Yuan pulled down the map from where it hung on the wall. Old Tan, how many deployable troops are there in the capital? Tan Hongfei licked his cracked lips. The northern camp has 2,000 suits of heavy armor and 16,000 light cavalrymen. There's also 2,000 chariots and 80 war chariots. Each chariot is outfitted with 3 Parhelion bows, plus a cannon on each end. This level of firepower was sufficient to force an abdication, but in the face of the Westerners' long-planned, all-out assault, it was a cup of water to a raging fire. Gu Yuan furrowed his brow. What about the Imperial Guard? The Imperial Guard is no good. They have less than 6,000 men in total, and over half of them are feckless noble sons who only know how to wave their weapons about and have never seen bloodshed. Tan Hongfei paused as he remembered something. He pulled an object from his lapels and, with both hands, held it out solemnly to Guyuan. Right. His Majesty asked me to give this to the Marshal. Wrapped in fine plain weave silk, it was presented like some precious gemstone of enormous value. When the package was unfolded, however, the ferocious-looking black iron tiger tally lay within. Guyuan glanced at the tiger tally, a thin smile bowing his lips. What's the point in returning this to me now? That ship has sailed. Tan Hongfei didn't know what to say. Guyuan carelessly tossed the black iron tiger tally back to Tan Hongfei. Very well. I see that His Majesty has made up his mind. Go ahead and write up mobilization orders in accordance with his wishes. Summon the troops garrisoned in Shandong and Zhili back to defend the capital against imminent siege. Send word to Cai Bing and instruct him to send reinforcements. Dispatch the mobilization orders first. If that fails, well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. The wizened old Zhang Fenghan wasn't at all so iron-hearted as those beasts of burden. After spending this whole time terrified out of his wits, he at once recognized the unspoken implication within Guyuan's words. The blood drained from the old Lingshu scholar's face, and he couldn't help but ask, "Does the Marquis mean that the reinforcements may fail to arrive?" Chang Geng spoke up from the side. If the information in these military reports can be trusted, it's impossible for the Westerners to have brought much in the way of supplies. They cannot afford to prolong this war. If they think to deal us a killing blow by making landfall in Jiangnan, they must split their forces in two, sending one contingent to advance on the capital by sea, while leaving the other to blockade us and cut off communication between the capital and the rest of the country by land. I'm afraid at this stage, we'll be lucky to get any of our military dispatches through the siege. Master Feng Han almost fainted on the spot, collapsing into a chair and hyperventilating. Chang Geng hadn't expected his words to affect the man so gravely. He hastened to pour Master Feng Han a glass of water, then skillfully tapped a handful of acupoints on his back. Please take it easy, sir. The older you get, the more careful you must be to avoid sudden fluctuations of extreme emotion. Otherwise, you could easily suffer a stroke. Zhang Fenghan grasped his hand, close to tears. My dear Highness, do you naturally lack a sense of crisis? Master Fenghan, please calm down. I haven't finished yet, Chang Geng continued hurriedly. Back when Yifu was thrown in prison, I was worried something like this might happen on the borders. I've already gotten in touch with a few of my friends. So saying, he produced a wooden bird from within his sleeve. These wooden birds utilize a special kind of magnet to direct their flight and can carry messages between holders of said magnets. My friends received my earlier messages, so they've doubtlessly already set out for each of the nation's major garrisons by now. Hopefully, there's still time. If the capital should really be besieged, I can use these wooden birds to send word and pass on information outside military channels. The Black Iron Tiger Tally and my Yifu's personal seal ought to lend our letters sufficient credibility. Chang Geng had realized that without the Black Hawks, the delay in long-distance communication would hamper military operations. Thus, he turned to the Linyuan Pavilion to preemptively organize a giant communications network in hopes of avoiding future disaster. Tan Hongfei and Zhang Fenghan gaped at Chang Geng in amazement. It's just a trifling little toy. I couldn't come up with anything else on such short notice, Chang Geng said. This plan is feasible as long as it remains a secret, but it's not suitable in the long term. The minute our enemies catch on, these birds will no longer be a secure mode of communication. They can be knocked out of the sky with a mere pebble. At that moment, Guyuan couldn't quite describe what he was feeling. He'd had worries about Chang Geng when he was in prison, but it seemed even if Guyuan had been free to handle matters, he couldn't have done much better himself. Not only had this child's timely actions saved half of the Black Iron Battalion, he'd also managed to preserve some room for them to maneuver. Guyuan sighed in appreciation. He was overwhelmed with pride. Yet, he also felt that the young boy who only knew to close his eyes and flee when faced with the sword-training puppet should not have grown up so quickly. And that was all because he'd failed to look after him properly. With so many other present, open sentimentality wasn't appropriate, so Gu Yuan merely offered nonchalantly, "Your Highness's actions have certainly been thorough and well considered." Gu Yuan plucked a wine jar from where it hung behind the door and, without bothering to don any armor, draped a straw raincoat casually over his shoulders. "Come on," he said to Tan Hongfei. "Let's head to the northern camp." Chang Geng rose as well. "I'll accompany Master Feng Han back to the Lingshu Institute. Then I'll stop by the Ministry of Revenue and see how things are going over there." The two rushed off on their separate ways. The ceaseless rolls of muted thunder on the horizon suddenly changed their tune. A dazzling flash of cold lightning split the dreary firmament in twain, and the torrential downpour seldom seen in spring relentlessly pounded the earth. The deluge fell in buckets as wind and rain swept across a gloomy sky. Braving the pelting tempest, Gu Yuan and Tan Hongfei sped out of the city toward the northern camp with a detachment of guards. Tan Hongfei fiercely shook off a face full of water droplets and at once remembered Huo Dan back at the Marquis estate, saying that the Marquis was ill. He couldn't help but spur his horse forward until he was abreast of Gu Yuan and bellow, "Sir, this rain is too heavy and you've yet to recover from your cold. Why don't we find somewhere to take shelter? Once the storm passes, we'll still have time to hurry on our way." Gu Yuan shook his head. For some reason, perhaps because this storm had rolled in too rapidly, he had a sudden and ominous premonition. Foreigners called the Black Iron Battalion Black Crows, and sure enough, as the leader of these black-winged harbingers, Gu Yuan was possessed of an unmatched crow's beak. A frightening number of his ominous premonitions seemed to come true with unfailing accuracy. Gu Yuan assumed control of the northern camp with grim efficiency. Meanwhile, Chang Geng hurried over with the precious steel armor and steam engines he had unearthed from the Lingshu Institute overnight. There were even numerous suits of heavy and hawk armor among his haul. Tan Hongfei had reckoned that the Westerners would begin their march north within a few days' time. He was too optimistic. That night, on a watchtower over Dagu Harbor, a long and cylindrical field scope peered out over the water. It was equipped with two palm-sized lens wipers that were scrubbing up and down, a futile effort, as a blast of wind soon forced the little things to bow their heads. The soldier standing watch in the tower reached out the window and groped around for a rust-mottled handle on the field scope side. The steam engine inside had broken down long ago and never been repaired, so the device had to be turned manually. The soldier flicked away a handful of raindrops and began to crank the long arm of the handle, cursing all the while. The chipped gears let out an exhausted shriek as a tiny metal umbrella spread unsteadily open, shielding the field scope from the bleak wind and icy rain. The soldier wiped away the film of water covering the scope's lens and grumbled to his companion, "We all serve in the army, but others fly through the sky shaking heaven and earth, while we're here spending our days in the tower sweeping the floor and playing dominoes. We don't even get any perks. Nothing ever happens, yet we waste our time here all year round. My woman barely even recognizes me anymore. Seriously, what the devil is going on with this rain? Was there a miscarriage of justice somewhere or what?" His companion didn't lift his head from where he was sweeping the floor. "You better keep praying nothing happens. Didn't you hear the squad leader say the Westerners are coming?" "The squad leader harps on about the Westerners a couple days a month," the soldier responded. "Isn't the Marquis of Anding still keeping an eye on things in the capital next door? The Marquis of Anding got thrown in prison, but they let him back out again, didn't they?" Here, the soldier seemed to realize something. "Wait, wasn't the rumor that the Marquis of Anding tried to force the emperor to abdicate? Why would they let him out so soon? Unless—" "Shh!" His companion's head snapped up. "Did you hear that?" A faint rumble like the roll of thunder shook the air. The watchtower began to tremble, as if it too sensed something coming. Was it a storm? No. Thunder came in intermittent crashes. It wouldn't linger on like this, drawing closer and closer. The old soldier lurched over to the field scope and swung its barrel up. Through the ink-black curtain of rain, the soldier's searching eyes crashed into an enormous shadow of water. Such a terrifying monster was beyond the stuff of nightmares. Extending its tentacles to the sky, it emitted a deafening roar. The old soldier doubted his own vision. He rubbed fiercely at his eyes. Yet this sea monster moved with such swiftness it seemed to fly. By the time the soldier looked again, it was no longer the blurry shadow from a moment ago. In the blink of an eye, it had traversed untold kilometers and could now be seen in clear detail through the field scope. Dense masses of sea dragons slipped through the darkness with a cold and murderous aura, and battle flags billowed in the wind and rain, viciously revealing their razor-sharp claws and fangs. "Enemy attack," the old soldier choked out. "What?" "Enemy attack. The Westerners are here. Sound the alarm. What are you doing standing there? Hurry!" An urgent drumbeat punctured the furious downpour as the watchtower's steady, rotating light began to swivel like mad. The news spread from 2 men to 10 and from 10 to 100 like wildfire. Within the span of a few breaths, every watchtower in Dagu Harbor reverberated with the pounding of war drums. Lian Wei, commander-in-chief of the Beihai Army and Navy, hadn't dared sleep a wink since receiving reports of the defeat in Jiangnan. With his heart beating so madly it was on the verge of crashing through his chest, he snatched the field scope from his personal guard's hand. A single glance, and a chill lanced from his chest all the way through his back. "Heaven help us." "Sir, deploy..." Lian Wei licked his lips. "Deploy all dragon warships to the vanguard. No warning shots necessary. Bombard the enemy with cannon fire. No, wait, iron chains. Lash the dragons together with iron chains and form a boom across the mouth of the harbor. Ready the Parhelians. Notify any fishing and merchant boats in the harbor to evacuate immediately." Lian Wei glanced back at his desk and the war beacon decree that he had yet to put away. This was the highest state of alert for Great Liang's military. The instant a war beacon decree came down, it meant that the entire nation had entered a state of imminent war. The war beacon decree was inscribed with the character Gu. It had been personally signed by the Marquis of Anding. Years ago, when the Black Iron Battalion had suffered the suicide attack on the northern border, over a dozen wrongfully accused junior and senior officers were forced to cast off their black iron armor, lay down their windslashers, and scatter to the far reaches of the country. By now, many of them had either withdrawn into obscurity or retired. As for Lian Wei, he'd imagined he would spend the rest of his life stuck in this tiny little harbor. Every day he'd stroll idly along the docks with his men in tow, and occasionally he'd deal with a case of petty gambling or scuffles between fishermen. "Send word to the northern camp." Lian Wei tightened the buckles of his armor and took a deep breath, sucking in his bulging paunch. "Tell them Dagu Harbor is under enemy attack by the Western Navy. Go, now." As he strode out, he seemed to remember something. He turned on his heel and picked up a windslasher that had been standing in the corner gathering dust all these years. This he slung over his back. The blade, once a seasoned veteran of desert battlefields, was now so badly rusted, even the tiny trough that stored violet gold could no longer be pried open. It had been reduced to a heavy black iron rod that probably couldn't serve much use beyond mugging people in the middle of the night. Yet, when Lian Wei strapped it on once more to his back, he seemed to regain the feeling he'd had when he donned black iron armor and gazed down upon the rest of the world in disdain. After so many years of wallowing in idleness, and beneath so many layers of fat, the brand left on his blood and bone by cold blade and steel armor hadn't faded in the least. The iron boom of dragon ships met the rampaging sea monster head on as the two forces closed in on each other. The Western warships cut through the wind and rain like demonic fiends, faster even than the whipping tempest brewing over the water. The stormy sea raised tidal waves so terrible they seemed capable of swallowing the mainland whole, and the uninterrupted report of cannon fire filled the heavens. Countless warships exploded into splinters in an instant, sinking beneath the roiling chests of the ocean waves. "Sir, the boom isn't going to hold." "Sir, we've lost too many ships on our left flank. The iron chains. The water tower. Look out!" A cannonball burst forth like a fiery dragon. Even the dense curtain of rain couldn't dim its raging flame as it scored a direct hit on a watchtower with an earth-shattering boom. The tower staggered for a breathless moment before slowly bending at the waist. The lantern casting light through the rain from atop the tower went dark. Shoving his personal guard aside, Lien Wei leapt onto the deck of the warship and bellowed, "Cannons! Maintain barrage fire! Parhelion! Load firebrand arrows!" "General Lien, it's impossible for Dagu to— Out of the way!" Lien Wei shoved the foot soldier standing by the Parhelion arrows aside. With a great shout, he hoisted the 50-some-kilogram firebrand arrow and slammed it down on the Parhelion bow. Scrubbing the rainwater from his face, he grabbed the Parhelion's calibrator. The first firebrand arrow tore from the Parhelion bow and ruthlessly blasted into the sky, shedding the iron shell encasing its tail mid-flight. Violet gold gleamed like impenetrable hellfire, spurring it on, and it gathered speed, brushing past the battle flag flying atop the sea monster like a streaking meteor and crashing among the waves. The force of the impact shredded the fluttering flag of the Holy See into diaper cloth, and the torn-up scraps scattered before the wind in all directions. But the firebrand arrow had yet to reach the end of its flight. It struck a rampaging western sea dragon, exploding over the ocean in a dazzling display of fireworks. Absent an order from their commander, members of the Black Iron Battalion dared not retreat a centimeter. Report of the attack on Dagu Harbor reached the capital in the middle of the night. Sitting in the commander's tent, Gu Yuan was in the midst of sorting out the capital's defenses with Tan Hongfei and Han Qi, the captain of the Imperial Guard. Shocked, Han Qi practically sprang to his feet. How could the attack come so fast? Gu Yuan's expression grew overcast. Who is the commanding officer of the Beihai Army and Navy? Lien Wei. The rims of Tan Hongfei's eyes reddened faintly. After a pause, he couldn't help but add, he was once this humble general's deputy in the Black Iron Battalion. Gu Yuan's eye twitched slightly. Captain Han. Han Qi caught on immediately. This humble general will return to the capital at once. Please rest assured, Marshal. Even if the Imperial Guard is no more than an assemblage of young noble masters, their final resting place lies before the city walls of the capital. Gu Yuan cast him a searching look before lifting the flap of the commander's tent. Can those old geezers at the Lingshu Institute please pick up the pace? He'd barely finished his grousing when a messenger hurried over. Sir, Prince Yanbei has arrived. Gu Yuan jerked his head up, but Chang Geng's horse had already galloped straight in. Pulling back on the reins, Chang Geng said, Marshal, the Lingshu Institute has completed repairs on the 1,000 suits of black iron heavy armor and 500 suits of hawk armor they have on hand. They've also sent over what light pelts they have in pieces, giving us a total of 3,000 sets of iron cuffs and vambraces, 4,000 pairs of polines and greaves, and a whole batch of pauldrons and visors. They'll be sending everything over shortly. Chapter 61. Report of Victory. Never in Tan Hongfei's wildest dreams had he imagined that he would don black iron armor again one day. All the sorrow in his heart evaporated. Even if he were to lose his life in this upcoming battle, he thought, it would be worth it for this. Tan Hongfei stepped forward and declared in a ringing voice, This subordinate is willing to join the Marshal's vanguard. Well, we certainly can't go without you. Parhelion bows and war chariots will clear the way. Light cavalry and Black Hawk units will follow me, and heavy armor will bring up the rear. Gu Yuan quickly passed out his orders. Someone get me a wind slasher. Whatever demon, ghost, or monster we face, we'll only know once we see it for ourselves. Chang Geng unshouldered the violet gold-assisted longbow from his back. It was the very same weapon he'd acquired from Gu Yuan when they were vanquishing bandits in the southwest. The bow seemed to be the last presentable invention of the Lingshu Institute before the long-gone emperor began to cut military spending in earnest. The unadorned iron bow was incredibly heavy. It was impossible for those who weren't true masters of archery to draw it. Thus, though it could have seen widespread use in the army after further refinement, This remained the only prototype of its kind in the entirety of the Great Liang military. Smoothing a hand across the ice-cold iron of the bow, Chang Geng asked, "Yifu, may I accompany you?" Guyuan hesitated. He didn't really want to bring him along, if for no reason other than that, over the course of this unfolding crisis, he had developed still greater expectations for this young and inexperienced little prince. Perhaps Guyuan could indeed dig in his heels before the capital and fight to the bitter end. But what then? Who would clean up the crumbling remains of the nation? Who would cut a path across the chaos and help the common people find their way through? Chang Geng was far more diplomatic in his personal conduct than Guyuan had been in his own youth. Maybe he wouldn't end up like Guyuan, caught in such a hopeless and unsalvageable situation after falling out with the emperor. Chang Geng seemed to sense the direction of his thoughts. No eggs remain whole when the nest overturns. As it stands, there's no difference between waiting in the palace and joining you on the front line. If the city falls, would it not merely be a matter of an earlier or later death? Before Guyuan could respond, Tan Hongfei burst into laughter. "Well said, Your Highness. The court is filled with pedantic scholars. Your Highness is the only real man among them." Guyuan could only wave a hand and say, "You've said all there is to say. If you want to come, then come." He shot Tan Hongfei a withering glare. Seeing the swollen whip mark, yet unhealed, on General Tan's face, he had a half a mind to give him another lash on his other cheek and make him symmetrical. Outside the walls of the capital, black iron formed a dense mass that curved around the city like the glimmering waters of a desert oasis. Looking back from atop their horses, the lights of Kite's Flight Pavilion were bright as ever under the heavy downpour. Yet, standing opposite the towering imperial city in the distance, they seemed enshrouded in a gentle luster, like the glow of polished tortoiseshell. The 20 red kites that only ever took flight on New Year's Eve had made an exception today. They floated high in the air like the uneasy eyes of an anxiously awaiting crowd. Guyuan raised his hand and gave the signal. The northern camp's vanguard had already solemnly moved out. There were no stirring, mournful songs, nor were there any fervent speeches. The soldiers marched through the rain, their faces hidden beneath visored helmets, like a platoon of invasive iron puppets. In the heavy deluge, the capital looked like it was floating on water, the city's ancient blue flagstones reflective as a mirror. The previous night, the Western Navy had sailed north and launched a surprise attack on Dagu Harbor. Lian Wei, commander-in-chief of the Beihai Army and Navy, led 300 dragons and 1,000 corvettes in a vigorous defense. They began by chaining their dragons together to form an iron boom across the mouth of the harbor. By 11:45 the next evening, every single dragon warship had sunk under the Western Sea monster's cannon fire. There were no survivors. The Beihai Navy had 36,000 firebrand arrows and 10,000 rounds of Parhelion iron arrows on hand. By the end of the battle, not a shaft remained. Everyone had been blasted into the furious waves of the bottomless deep. When they ran out of ammunition, General Lian ordered his captains to power their corvettes to full speed and, using their ships as firebrands and their own bodies as parhelions, rammed their vessels into the enemy's ranks. Raging fire spread over the city as loyal souls sacrificed themselves in the line of duty. The Beihai Navy bombed, sank, and smashed to pieces nearly 3,000 enemy warships. Ultimately, they forced the Western Sea Monster to brave the rain and open the hangars at the tips of their iron tentacles to launch the armored hawks hidden within. Only when the bedraggled enemy hawks reached the shore did they discover that Dagu Harbor had but a bare handful of active combatants remaining. By 3 in the morning, the Westerners who had breached the shore were profoundly vexed. Eager to make up for the losses sustained in battle, rather than remain longer in the area, they chose to advance directly to the capital. On the way, they encountered the Black Iron Battalion, that is, the Black Iron Battalion that Gu Yuan had spent a single day and night cobbling together on the outskirts of Donggan City. The Western Navy forces had yet to recover from their disastrous and casualty-heavy landfall. They were caught completely off guard and were soon driven back by the 80 war chariots leading the charge. The Black Iron Battalion followed their initial onslaught with a second wave. Light cavalrymen rode out from their encirclement, and hawks soared high overhead, their fearsome cries slicing through the air like swords. Met suddenly with wind slashers in the hands of light cavalry, the Pope's personal guard nearly scattered then and there. They made a hasty retreat back to their ships in Dagu harbor. It had been years since Great Liang had endured such a harrowing night. Messengers bearing military reports sped in and out of the palace as though they were running to the market, more frequent than the strikes of the night watch. Not a soul in the capital slept soundly until the next morning, when reports of victory arrived alongside the first glimmers of dawn. It was the first good news in days. When Li Feng heard, he went weak at the knees, momentarily torn between laughter and tears. Just as the sky cleared after the rain, so too came hope after hardship. The high river swelled overnight, and an indescribable smell, mixed with the scent of gunpowder and blood, filled the air. The earth had already thawed, and the humidity lingered heavy on the breeze. Gu Yuan had no navy, and the Westerners were in a sorry state. So after a night of fierce battle, both forces retreated to their respective fortifications. Gu Yuan sat beside the cannon, still emanating residual warmth, his black iron helmet tossed to the side and a loose lock of messy hair obscuring his face. He accepted a bowl of medicine from Chang Geng and tossed its contents back in one gulp. I didn't bring my acupuncture needles, but even if I had, I wouldn't dare stab you with any of them right now, Chang Geng said. After wielding that iron bow the whole night through, his palms were covered in deep grooves, and his fingers still trembled from fatigue. Gu Yuan caught him by the wrist and pulled him over. Only when he confirmed that Chang Geng was exhausted but uninjured did he relax. He waved a hand and said, "Don't worry about me. Go count the casualties. Old Tan has no head for numbers." With that, he leaned right back against the cannon, making the most of this little downtime to rest his eyes. Yet moments later, Gu Yuan was startled awake by a herald from the imperial city. The herald who rushed to the scene was an imperial guard with a rather youthful face. Under ordinary circumstances, one of his rank would have little opportunity to meet Gu Yuan. Seeing the Marquis of Order in the flesh, he was so excited he could barely contain himself. The young soldier galloped straight up to Gu Yuan and leapt from his saddle, but his foot must have caught on something, for he lost his balance and face-planted precisely at Gu Yuan's feet. "My lord!" Gu Yuan hastily retracted his toes. "Hi-yo, no need to be quite this courteous." "My lord," the herald responded eagerly, "His Majesty has tasked me with rewarding the northern camp with food and drink. I've brought... Wonderful. In his excitement, he'd forgotten his lines. No wonder the northern camp had beat the crap out of the Imperial Guard. Exasperated, Gu Yuan climbed to his feet and patted the young soldier on the head. "There's no need to tell me. You can let General Tan handle this kind of thing. Go inform His Majesty that it's too early to celebrate. The northern camp has a limited number of troops. Even I can't magic more soldiers into existence when we run out of men. If reinforcements don't arrive by then..." The herald stared at him, taken aback. As stated in The Art of War, win in battle, led by convention, win by ingenuity. Most people only remembered win by ingenuity, thinking that a famous general must be able to fight his way out of any impasse and save a great edifice on the verge of collapse single-handedly. But that wasn't possible, not unless Gu Yuan could sculpt out of mud an army of godlike soldiers who neither ate nor drank. Now that news of Gu Yuan's victory in his first battle had spread back to the capital, the court officials were sure to be overjoyed. But what came next? Never mind such long-term goals as competing with the Westerners on the grand scale of national strength, material stockpiles, and available resources. He had only this small portion of military power in his hands right now. What could he possibly do? Guyuan knew very well that however impressive this opening match appeared, he was in truth putting up a last-ditch struggle with his back against the wall. He offered the Emperor's herald a grim smile. Then he left the young man hanging where he stood and strolled over to Tan Hongfei. Tan Hongfei was holding a wind slasher that had been crushed flat on the end. Through the black scorch marks marring the tip, half the inscription of the characters Lien was still faintly visible. Many soldiers carved their names onto their wind slashers. That way, even if they handed their blade in for maintenance, they could be reunited with the partner who had accompanied them through so many life and death struggles. In the event that the owner of such a weapon should fall in battle and his body be unrecoverable, his brothers in arms would bring back his wind slasher and pour out a pot of wine in libation before it so their brother's soul could rest in peace. Tan Hongfei lifted that wind slasher in both hands and presented it to Guyuan. Sir. Guyuan accepted the proffered blade. Suddenly, he felt that despite its many misfortunes, the Black Iron Battalion, which had gathered and separated time and again, had always been supporting the nation, woven deep into its foundation. Its members were like a handful of seeds scattered in all directions. You never knew where a towering tree might unexpectedly sprout up toward the sky. Chang Geng walked up behind him. Last night, we lost a total of 13 war chariots. In addition, 500 light cavalrymen were killed in action and close to 1,000 seriously wounded. Those with minor injuries weren't counted, so I didn't include them in my final tabulation. We also lost 12 armored hawks. Most of our gold tanks exploded in midair, so I'm afraid the bodies... Guyuan nodded. These casualty numbers were acceptable. This is thanks to General Lian's efforts. I fear there will be those who urge us to initiate peace talks during this morning's court session. Chang Geng said quietly. It won't work, Guyuan said with a sigh. The foreigners suffered a great humiliation yesterday. They won't have the face for peace talks now, and until they've besieged the capital so thoroughly that we couldn't escape even if we sprouted wings, they won't be open to having them. And that was likely only a matter of time. Chang Geng fell silent for a spell. I've heard it said that the last emperor of the previous dynasty dwelt with a similar crisis in which the northern barbarians attacked by sneaking out of the city through a secret passage. If we really can't defend the capital, we defend it to the end, regardless, Guyuan responded. Do you know the Sunlight Palace west of the capital? Chang Geng started in surprise. Guyuan lifted a finger to his lips and spoke no further. The Sunlight Palace on the west side of the capital was built during the Yuanhe Emperor's reign. The late emperor had no tolerance for hot weather and spent every summer at the Sunlight Palace to escape the heat. After Li Feng ascended, he hewed to simplicity in all things, from food and drink to everyday expenses. Even the empress and the imperial harem's cosmetics allowance was halved. He never indulged in extravagances like hunting or pleasure excursions. Yet, despite being such a frugal person, the complete opposite of his father, Li Feng had inherited his habit of removing to the temporary imperial residence every summer. Not that he went there to enjoy himself, due to the speed with which government work piled up. He usually hurried over to the imperial city so early in the morning that the moon and stars still hung in the sky, only to hurry right back to the summer palace before nightfall, touring the capital city as though he were walking a dog and returning just in time for morning roll call. Forget trying to escape the hot weather. With all this running about, he was lucky if he didn't get a heat stroke. Considering the way Li Feng fused over this, if there weren't something wrong with his head, it could only mean that there was something stored within the Sunlight Palace which required frequent and personal monitoring. Chang Geng's mind was keen as ever, and he was immediately struck with an idea. Defending generals on all 4 of the nation's borders had at one point or another privately hoarded violet gold. Then what about the emperor? Chang Geng had only recently joined the imperial court, so he had yet to finish auditing the Ministry of Revenue and War's accounts. But given Li Feng's control-freak personality, it wouldn't be all that strange for him to maintain a private cache of violet gold. Your big brother trusts no one, Gu Yuan said softly. So this is merely my own conjecture. Don't tell anyone else. Chang Geng frowned. Well, that's going to be a bit troublesome. Do you think Li Feng will sue for peace when the time comes? Gu Yuan couldn't help it. He burst out laughing. Shaking his head, he said, maybe if the other party comes to him asking to open peace talks. Oh, but it's unlikely that he'll run either. Chang Geng clasped his hands behind his back. He was covered in filth from head to toe. The muddy water that had splashed him the night before had dried, leaving him mottled in a spectacular array of gaudy colors. Yet the young commandery Prince Yanbei donned the colors with leisurely composure and processed through the camp as if he were merely taking a post-meal afternoon stroll through the imperial gardens. After a moment's consideration, he said blandly, True, Li Feng does not fear death. He fears something else. Gu Yuan couldn't help but shoot him a glance. He realized Master Feng Han was right. Chang Geng really did always seem wholly unperturbed. He suddenly asked, When exactly did you become so cool and collected? How am I cool and collected? I'm terribly impetuous, honestly. Chang Geng said with a laugh, Actually, I learned this from you. I noticed that Yifu always pretends to be awfully happy when you're upset. If you put on a show of being cheerful, the distress in your heart becomes easier to bear. So whenever I'm feeling particularly restless, I try to slow down a little. And in doing so, I really do find myself becoming more calm. Oh, and also, excess internal heat in the liver is detrimental to maintaining good health and makes it difficult to fall asleep. Gu Yuan had been exasperated by this line of his on more than one occasion and could at this point finish his sentence. Just how deeply do you care about sleeping? Also, when do I ever force a smile when I'm unhappy? Chang Geng raised an eyebrow, the very image of calm amid chaos as he looked at him. The words, whatever you say, were written plain across his face. Assemble the troops for a tactical withdrawal. Gu Yuan weakly changed the subject. Send the wounded back first. It won't be long before the Westerners recover their wits. We're going to lay an ambush. After walking a few steps, Gu Yuan found himself abruptly overcome with intense exhaustion. He couldn't help but think back to Chang Geng's spiel from a minute ago. Who knows what fraud of a doctor had taught him such quackery? He untied the wine pot from his waist and took a swig, then strapped General Lian's windslasher to his back and whistled sharply. A warhorse trotted up in response, and the trill of his whistle dipped, capriciously transforming into a self-penned ditty. He bent down to pluck a tiny yellow wildflower from the turf, then vaulted onto his steed and called out, My light cavalry brothers, mount your horses and follow me. Wildflower in hand, Gu Yuan had planned to casually tuck it into Chang Geng's hair where he stood closest to him. Just as he raised his hand, however, he found himself ensnared by Chang Geng's gaze. He was surprised to find that Chang Geng's eyes had followed him closely all this time. The expression on his face seemed to declare, Even if you place the wedding veil on my head, I wouldn't mind. Gu Yuan shivered slightly. In the end, he didn't dare follow through with this piece of mischief and stuck the flower in Tan Hongfei's stock pot-sized helmet instead, providing a vivid enactment of the expression, a fresh flower stuck in a pile of you-know-what. As the wily old veterans of the northern camp roared with laughter, the black-armored light cavalry followed in Gu Yuan's footsteps and dashed away, accompanied by a chorus of shrill whistles as, 2-1, they emulated his example. Tunes of all kinds, with origins in all regions of the country, rose and fell in rapid succession. From his position at the front, Gu Yuan bellowed furiously, What are you copying me for? You're going to make me pee my pants. It was an odd thing. After all the ruckus, he really did feel rather refreshed. Elsewhere aboard the Western Sea monster. A battered and exhausted Mr. Jia pushed open the cabin door and ran right into the captain of the Pope's personal guard. "How is he?" Mr. Jia asked. "He's awake," answered the captain. "His Holiness was just about to call for you." During the harried naval battle, the Pope's position was grazed by a firebrand arrow, and an artillery battery aboard detonated with such force that the venerated commander lost consciousness on the spot. The Pope's incapacitation dealt a devastating blow to the Western Navy, which had thereafter suffered a thrashing each time they encountered the Black Iron Battalion. Mr. Jia heaved a sigh of relief and stepped into the cabin. The Pope's forehead was slathered in a medicinal poultice, and his limp white hair lay scattered on the pillow, revealing subtle liver spots at the corners of his eyes. Mr. Jia fell to his knees. "Your Holiness," he said, his face full of dismay. "I'm so terribly sorry." The elder man on the bed murmured without opening his eyes. "It's Guyuan." "Yes, it's Guyuan. We planned to pin him down here and even made preparations to engage him in the Beihai region, but yesterday the Black Crows appeared out of nowhere." Mr. Jia paused, obviously frustrated. "With the Black Iron Battalion held in Jiayu Pass by the allied armies of the western regions, I am confident of our success, and yet you lost control of the front lines." Mr. Jia could not reply. The Pope smiled. "Over the course of our lives, we all encounter enemies who seem invincible. Some are great catastrophes, while others are merely tests of character. Do you know the difference between a catastrophe and a test?" Mr. Jia stared at him uncomprehendingly. "The difference is this. Catastrophes are insurmountable, while tests may be overcome. I believe it is quite easy to distinguish the two. We have already cut the communication lines of the Central Plains people. If their tiny capital truly had so much fighting power at their disposal, would events have so readily spiraled out of control when we incited the northern camp to mutiny?" "You mean—" "Gu may be young, but he has spent the greater part of his life on the battlefield. Do not allow him to lead you by the nose. Even if he is an insufferably arrogant king of wolves, he has at present been detained and defanged. Go. Do not lose confidence so easily." That day, the Western Navy once again rallied their troops and sent a landing party into Dagu Harbor. They were again met with an intense onslaught upon landfall. This time, fighting in the light of day, Mr. Jia felt much more assured. Under his steady and methodical command, the Western soldiers made quick work of their beleaguered adversaries and captured every last one of the defending heavy armor units. It was an easy victory. Yet before Mr. Jia could revel in it, he lifted the visor of one of these newly captured prisoners of war and found that these soldiers were not members of Great Liang's armored cavalry at all, but a bunch of iron puppets. The puppets had plainly been conscripted from the households of high officials and eminent personages of the capital at the 11th hour. Beneath one puppet's visor, there even lay a deathly pale child's mask. It had a large round face and leered at them with a bloody maw of a grin in unspeakable derision. One Western soldier, unable to restrain his anger, reached out and yanked it off. Mr. Jia cried in alarm, "Wait, don't!" But his words came too late. The mask was affixed to a thin fuse at the slightest tug. The iron puppet exploded with a thunderous boom, blasting more than a few of the Western soldiers nearby sky high. Half of the cracked mask clattered down to the rest of Mr. Jia's feet, its mouth still drawn in that mocking smile. By the time these decoys had discharged their mission, the northern camp had long finished their general retreat from the harbor. The Western Navy furiously charged their way into the city, prepared to quench their anger with blood, but found naught but an empty fort. When news of enemy attack in Jiangnan had reached the capital, Prince Yanbei had ordered his men to evacuate civilians from the front lines without delay. Of course, there were those who staunchly refused to leave their homes, but after the deafening roars of artillery fire howled in their ears that first night, they too had picked up and fled. and were by now long gone. In preparation for the Westerners' arrival, Gu Yuan had left behind nothing but scorched earth. Chapter 62. Siege. The deserted city was deathly still. The hair-raising silence set the soldiers on edge, one small fright away from panic. Mr. Jia waved his hand, and his men scattered in all directions to search civilian homes. The houses and courtyards here were built along the city's winding rivers, twisting and turning through the streets. It was all too easy for outsiders to lose their bearings. Here and there, the soldiers also encountered giant boulders blocking their way. This only served to make the incomprehensible topography even more impossible to unravel. Mr. Jia had an ominous premonition. He suddenly regretted his impulse to advance so quickly. At that moment, a Western soldier cried out in alarm. Like a flock of birds startled by the twang of a bow, the men around him drew their swords as one. In no time at all, countless suits of steel armor had gathered in a circle, each and every one aiming pitch-black cannon muzzles at a suspicious pagoda tree. It was then that they saw what hung from the branches, the body of a Western soldier, swinging limply. Half the man's face had been blasted away. Who could say on which battlefield he had died? Strapped to the bloody wreckage of the man's head was a deathly pale mask. This time, its painted face was weeping. An explosion rocked the area. One of the Western soldiers had, in his agitation, accidentally fired his cannon. The corpse hanging from the tree exploded in a shower of mangled flesh, and raw meat fell in chunks. Hair-raising laughter filled the air. As if faced with some great enemy, the Western soldiers beneath the tree cautiously retreated in unison. Seconds later, a round-faced owl poked its head out from the tree's canopy. After loftily surveying the two-legged beasts below, it shot straight into the sky with the flap of its wings, leaving that unnerving laughter to drift in all directions. Though they stood in broad daylight, the sound still made the soldiers break out in a cold sweat. "Lord Jacobson, should we continue the search?" Mr. Jia swallowed with difficulty. "No. Pull back for now. Let's get out of here immediately." He'd barely issued his order when another sharp explosion went off, this time in the distance. The sound was followed by blood-curdling screams as a number of fireworks whistled through the air and blossomed into a brilliant display in the sky. "It's an ambush!" someone shouted, their expression twisting in panic. "Fall back! Retreat!" The boom of cannon fire and hiss of arrows tangled in a cacophonous racket as several more explosions of unknown origin knocked over a tottering stone house. The shattered rock littered the thorn fares and, combined with the giant road-blocking boulders from before, turned the deserted city into a giant maze that rendered the Westerners' map a useless scrap of paper. The weakness that was the outsiders' unfamiliarity with the terrain became obvious. Trapped in this labyrinth, the group of heavy armor infantrymen and foot soldiers buzzed aimlessly around like headless flies for a long while, but still could not find their way out. Mr. Jia had little choice but to whistle a summons to the Western Hawks so they could lead the ground troops out from the air. The pain-stricken Western troops beat a hasty retreat to the city gates. Yet someone must have tripped some mechanism as they stumbled out, for all of a sudden there came an ear-splitting screech of grinding gears from atop the city wall. The Western soldiers instantly drew their bows, their countless arrows trained on the gate tower. An object floated down from above. Mr. Jia pushed aside his terror-stricken personal guards and stepped forward. When he saw what it was that had fallen, he flew into a rage, his features twisting until they were almost unrecognizable. It was yet another deathly pale mask, this time with a silly, cock-eyed grin. "My lord, perhaps we ought to take the long way around." Mr. Jia raised a hand to cut the soldier off. He stood there for a time, his expression sinister. "His Holiness was right. Gu Yuan has no cards left. So he must rely on these cheap tricks. Don't tell me you're all scared witless because of a few lousy masks. An ambush. Ha! He scoffed. He was so angry he could only laugh. Raze the city to the ground, he said coldly. Then we shall see where they lay their ambush. But more than 2 hours later, after leveling the entire settlement and searching thrice amid the wreckage, Mr. Jia was forced to admit that this shitty hellhole that had wasted so much of his precious time and violet gold really was but an empty shell. The so-called ambush had amounted to nothing more than a few white masks and an owl which had long flown away. Mr. Jia ground his teeth so violently his gums nearly began to bleed. Where are the scout hawks? After them. Give chase at full speed. Meanwhile, on the only road leading to the capital from Dong'an, hidden under a tree, Guyuan accepted a field scope from Tan Hongfei and raised it to his eye, following the handful of scout hawks hurtling overhead toward the capital. He spat out the stalk of grass he had been worrying between his teeth and patted Lian Wei's windslasher, which still hung on his back. Old Lian, you've done a great deed. What is it? Tan Hongfei asked quietly. Haven't you noticed? Guyuan said lazily. The commander who led the Westerners before is likely dead or wounded. The person presently giving orders is clearly unfamiliar with the capital. Otherwise, he would never so rashly send his scout hawks off in a fit of rage. The vital region of the capital held the imperial city nestled within its center. Thus, it always had extremely tight security against intrusion. Even Black Hawks didn't dare fly through its airspace. It wasn't because soldiers of the Black Iron Battalion were particularly conscientious and rule-abiding. It was because Guyuan knew that if a Black Hawk defied these rules, they could easily run into the aerial exclusion field. Beyond the 9 city gates of the capital lay the invisible aerial exclusion field. Construction on this device had begun during Emperor Wu's reign and was only completed 30 years later. This was the Lingshu Institute's magnum opus. Beneath the perimeter of the aerial exclusion field lay countless hidden mechanisms, all controlled by a dispatch center at Kite's Flight Pavilion. The towering Kite's Flight Pavilion was a popular tourist destination where travelers from the world over could eat, drink, and make merry. But it was not the primary reason it was built so tall. It also served a vitally important function. It was the linchpin of the aerial exclusion field. On Moonshot Platform, there was a Cosmos Pavilion that kept its heavy doors locked at all times. Who knew how many great masters of the Lingshu Institute had gone bald building this Cosmos Pavilion? The unique network of light it cast from beyond the 9 city gates was so fine that even at night it was easily drowned out by the illumination of the moon and stars and the overflowing lamplight of the city. Unless one possessed extraordinary senses, it was nigh possible to see with the naked eye. This network of light hovered 100 meters above ground. The people and animals moving below were not impeded by it in the slightest. As for any who tried to fly into the capital in hawk armor, at low altitudes of 100 meters or fewer, they would be spotted by sentries on the 9 city gates and welcomed with a volley of Parhelion arrows. If they tried their luck above 100 meters, they would encounter the aerial exclusion field. As soon as this field was breached, the disturbance in the network of light would reflect back to Cosmos Pavilion, then reflect yet again off a specialized mirror back to its point of origin, where it would trigger hidden mechanisms buried along the perimeter of the net. Once locked onto the invader's position, the field's defenses would shoot the airborne trespasser down from 8 different directions at once. If the armored hawk attempted to evade the attack, they would find no matter where they tried to take cover within the aerial exclusion field, there would always be hidden ordnance waiting to openly or secretly attack from the shadows. Only on New Year's Eve did the aerial exclusion field shut down. This was the singular day of the year when Cosmos Pavilion conducted maintenance. On that day, sentries stationed on the red-headed kites took over surveillance of the skies. "The Scout Hawks are taking a one-way trip," said Gu Yuan. "The foreign commander will soon recall the legendary aerial exclusion field. With the war beacon decree in effect, the red-headed kites will take flight. The placement of the aerial exclusion field will also be adjusted accordingly. It will take the Westerners some time to figure out its exact coordinates, so the closer they get to the capital, the more reluctant their armored hawks will be to fly too high." Gu Yuan muttered into Tan Hongfei's ear, "Pass my order on to our brothers. Tell them to get some rest. We move after nightfall. The Black Hawks will lead the charge and suppress the enemy from above. The light cavalry units will follow, flanking the enemy on both sides and smashing through the enemy's formation. Warn them not to zealously extend the fight. A single strike will do. We don't want to become trapped. As for the charioteers, pretend to cut off their retreat. Batter them with a few rounds of attacks. Then let them pass. We're not looking to force the enemy into a life and death struggle. We don't have the men for that." "Sir, why didn't we lay an ambush at Dagu Harbor?" Tan Hongfei asked quietly. "Who on earth would lay an ambush in broad daylight?" Gu Yuan rolled his eyes. "Is there something wrong with your head?" At that moment, Mr. Jia must have sneezed twice in rapid succession. Tan Hongfei modestly considered this for a while and concluded that what Gu Yuan said made great sense. Thus, he asked a different question. "Sir, how do you know they'll get here by nightfall?" "Your darling Prince Yanbei ran the numbers. If he's wrong, I'm docking his pay. It's not like he needs it. The money in his red envelope at New Year's is more than half of my annual salary." Chang Geng was presently sitting off to the side, repairing the grip of his iron bow. After fighting through the night, the leather had begun to fray. He had produced a tiny file and a scrap of new leather from who knows where and begun to fix it, his fingers so dexterous they dazzled the eyes. Despite being called out so suddenly, Chang Geng didn't even lift his head as he smiled. "Well, regardless of what happens, everything's recorded in one ledger at the Marquis estate anyway." Tan Hongfei was a bit of a bore. He lived by the philosophy that all fellow soldiers were his own brothers. After fighting shoulder to shoulder, he had long taken Prince Yanbei as one of his own and cared not a whit about his parentage. Upon hearing Chang Geng's response, he immediately shot off his mouth and teased him. "Our Highness shares everything with the Marquis. If only you were a princess. That way, maybe you could add a princess's tent to our camp again, just like we did back in the day." Gu Yuan was beyond words. He couldn't help but grit his teeth in irritation. Chang Geng's hands stilled. After a beat, he picked up the thread of Tan Hongfei's conversation. "But what a pity. The Marquis, whose beauty drives crowds to fill his carriage with flowers and fruit, wouldn't want me unless I had a face like flowers blooming under moonlight." "Ayo, but wait. That match wouldn't work," the simple-minded Tan Hongfei said. "His Majesty usually calls our marshal Imperial Uncle. You belong to a different generation." "Fuck off," Gu Yuan snapped. Tan Hongfei, who was purely yanking his chain, and Prince Yanbei, who harbored secret intentions, both burst into laughter. Shortly after nightfall, the call of the cuckoo bird sounded from a short distance away. This was the signal. Their enemies had come within range. Tan Hongfei was about to rise when Gu Yuan pushed him back down. "Wait a little longer," Gu Yuan murmured, "until the fourth watch." His eyes were terrifyingly bright in the black of night, like a pair of divine blades ready to draw blood the instant they were unsheathed. Tan Hongfei couldn't help but lick his cracked lips. How exactly does His Highness figure out the timing? Seriously. Gu Yuan was about to say, "His teacher is old General Zhong," when Chang Geng, who had at some point walked up behind him, cut in. "Merely a natural consequence of spending all my time sorting out budgets and running calculations." "What?" Tan Hongfei asked, flummoxed. Chang Geng shot Gu Yuan a glance. "I have to prepare a dowry so I can marry a general." "You're still going on about that?" Gu Yuan hissed irritably. The idiot Tan Hongfei began to snicker. Gu Yuan was completely powerless against bastards like these who specialized in poking people in their sore spots and spared no effort in driving their commanding officer mad. On top of that, When did this little brat Chang Geng become so fearless of him? Back at the hot spring villa, Gu Yuan had advised him to shoulder fewer mental burdens. To his surprise, Chang Geng seemed to have actually taken his advice and moved forward with a lighter heart. Chang Geng knew when to quit, so after teasing Gu Yuan, he made up for it by saying, "Yifu, I'm just joking. Don't get mad. Our marshal's temper isn't that ferocious," Tan Hongfei said. "All these years, I've only ever seen him blow up that one time at the palace." Even a man like Tan Hongfei realized he misspoke the instant the words left his mouth. He promptly shut it in embarrassment. Gu Yuan's expression cooled at once. Unable to contain himself, Tan Hongfei blurted out a short while later, "Sir, about that." Gu Yuan cut him off. "Tell the Blackhawks to prepare for takeoff." Tan Hongfei ground his teeth, but in the end, he could do nothing but sigh. Chang Geng patted him on the shoulder. "I'll go." The night gradually deepened as the moon sank below the horizon and Qiming climbed into the sky. The darkest hour had arrived, just before dawn. Mr. Jia had marched through the daylight hours on tenterhooks, worrying again and again that his troops would run into Gu Yuan's ambush. Trepidation and anger roiled in his mind, leaving him unable to relax even when they made camp for the night. He feared that, after so many false alarms, Gu Yuan would finally follow through with a real attack. Thus, Mr. Jia spent the night terrified of shutting his eyes. Only when it was nearly dawn and he saw that his surroundings remained as quiet and peaceful as ever, did Mr. Jia finally succumb to his exhaustion and briefly doze. Yet, just as he was about to sink into a deeper sleep, the booming sound of an explosion came from outside. Mr. Jia woke in a cold sweat and rolled out of bed. He ran from his tent to see the vast night sky ablaze with fire. "My lord, look out!" A flaming volley of arrows rained down from the vault of heaven as a soldier shoved Mr. Jia aside. As if seared by the conflagration, the night wind itself curled with steam. A chorus of battle cries pierced the air, and 2 squadrons of black steeds stormed past the dark cyclone. "Heavy armor units, hold your positions," Mr. Jia howled. "Do not panic. The Central Plains troops lack in number." Before he could continue, a thunderous rumble rose behind him. A line of war chariots seemed to appear from nowhere like an army of ghosts. They charged forward, sand and stone flying in their wake as mayhem descended on the camp. Mr. Jia was a master at sowing dissent and exercising diplomacy. Yet, however he might excel at scheming and intrigue, he wasn't a terribly competent commander in the field. He was overly accustomed to acting only after careful deliberation. Once the enemy exceeded his expectations, he struggled to react with speed and easily lost control of his troops. An indescribable chill crawled up his spine. Mr. Jia suddenly felt as if he were a frog paralyzed by the killing intent of a venomous snake. He looked back in terror and spied an iron arrow hurtling across the sky like a shooting star chasing the moon, heading straight for him. It was too late for Mr. Jia to evade. In this moment of imminent peril, a heavy armor infantryman threw himself before his commander with a furious roar. The iron arrow punched through the heavy armor's thick iron plating, its tip peeking viciously from the soldier's back. Reeling in shock, Minister Jia traced the trajectory of the arrow to its source and saw a young man with a long bow in hand standing atop the back of a black hawk. With the field scope still sitting on the bridge of his nose to help him calibrate his shot, the young man gazed down, or perhaps more accurately, looked askance at Mr. Jia, his eyes filled with poison. Master Jia's personal guards swung their cannons up toward the Black Hawk, covering the sky. The youth appeared to smile, then shook his head with a nonchalant expression as if to say, "How unfortunate that I missed my target." Then he coolly leapt from low altitude, parting ways with the Black Hawk and perfectly dodging a smoking cannonball. Gu Yuan shot forward on his horse and caught Chang Geng, who had just jumped down almost 20 meters. With a hiss of steam, the blades of the wind slasher in his hand spun in an invisible whirlwind of iron. His horse reared, and he swung his wind slasher in an arc with a sharp and sustained whistle. A spot of blood, its owner unknown, landed on the cinnabar beauty mark at the corner of his eye. With a squeeze of his legs against the flanks of his steed, the warhorse sprang out of the heart of the fray in the blink of an eye. Guyuan smacked Chang Geng harshly on the back. "Asshole, do you want to die?" Chang Geng had intended to jump straight down and then activate the steam propulsion of his light pelt armor's greaves to slow his descent as he neared the ground. He hadn't expected Guyuan to intervene like this and was momentarily speechless. As he stared at Guyuan's face from mere centimeters away, a violent tremor shuddered through his chest. He nearly lost his seat on the horse and could only clutch at the cold iron gauntlet encasing Guyuan's wrist. This gaze tore through his stoic facade in an instant, burning so fiercely it was like a physical touch. Grumpily, Guyuan asked, "What are you looking at?" Chang Geng forced himself to calm down, briefly closing his eyes to stifle the flames smoldering therein. He coughed awkwardly. "It's about time to cast the net." Guyuan pulled him up against his chest, then wheeled his horse around and let out a shrill whistle. The light cavalry units reformed their ranks to charge the enemy as one, as if they were rolling up a rug. After falling into disarray under the aerial bombardment from the Black Hawks, the Western soldiers finally began to clumsily fall back into formation. Mr. Jia bellowed, "Heavy armor, lead the charge! Tear a hole through their rear guard!" But there was no need to tear a hole through their rear guard. The war chariots of the northern camp had deliberately thinned their ranks. They scattered at the slightest touch, as if incapable of withstanding the enemy's assault, and allowed the Western soldiers to retreat. Guyuan gave a signal to Tan Hongfei nearby. The Black Iron Light cavalry quietly withdrew like a pack of lackadaisical wolves. They ran after taking one bite and quit while ahead. Such a small light cavalry force wouldn't stand a chance if they waited for the Western army to regroup. By the time the Western army once again got their wits about them, the black cyclone had already blown past and disappeared into the boundless night sky, never to be found. The 7th year of Longan, the 15th day of the 4th month, the Black Iron Battalion ambushed the Western army west of Donggan City under the cover of night. The 7th day of the 4th month. After being led a merry dance for 2 consecutive days, the Westerners' advance guard could no longer bear the Black Iron Battalion's persistent attacks and paused their advance to request reinforcements from their fleet at Dagu Harbor. The 23rd day of the 4th month, the Westerners' reinforcements arrived, forcing the Black Iron Light Cavalry to withdraw. The Western Army pursued their retreating enemy all the way to Wuqing District, where they were lured by Guyuan into tripping the aerial exclusion field and lost over half of their armored hawks. The Westerners once again had no choice but to retreat. The 26th day of the 4th month. The Pope's condition slightly improved. He directly took to the field in person. The 29th day of the 4th month. Wuqing fell into enemy hands. The 3rd day of the 5th month. The Western Army bombarded Daxing Prefecture with cannon fire. In the face of unrelenting pressure from an army tens of thousands strong, Guyuan had led the northern camp's meager light cavalry and armored hawks against the Westerners' superior force for nearly a month, but in the end, it was impossible to continue. The 7th. Guyuan retreated to the capital with his troops and barred the 9 city gates. Still, reinforcements had yet to arrive. By now, all past debts of gratitude, grudges, love, and hatred had retreated behind the city walls. In the capital of Great Liang, summer arrived in the dense shadows of viridescent trees. But there were no longer any pleasure boats wrapped in music and song adrift on its man-made lakes. And so, the Westerners finally sent forth their sanctimonious peace envoy. Okay, you guys. We have officially finished Stars of Chaos Volume 2. And wow. Well, I mean, you guys heard how it ended. So I guess there's really nothing I need to say at this point. I love that we get to see Guyuin's mastery of strategy and war, which is really cool, even though, in the end they were pushed back, which he knew it was probably going to be that way. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, let's just go ahead and get to volume 3, shall we? So I'll see you guys next time. Well, Einiman.